lot of problems with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and one of them is that we haven't been able to read the entire thing yet, but we do know that it gives the ability to multinational corporations to sue national governments, right? And so what we know from precedent is that ability to sue has been used to take on very good climate policies. For instance, I mentioned Germany. Germany is being challenged through a similar investor rights clause by a Swedish company, an energy company that was doing business in Germany. It's now suing Germany for 4.7 billion euros, saying that its transition to renewable energy is standing in the way of its plans to earn profits from coal and nuclear. That's one example. So there are other examples, like for instance, you mentioned we just heard about the fight against fracking. In Canada, the province of Quebec has successfully banned fracking. It's one of the successes, one of the early ones, but it's being challenged. Its fracking is being challenged under NAFTA by an American gas company that says that it violates their right to drill for gas under the St. Lawrence River. So that doesn't mean they'll win, but all of this is just slowing us down when we need to be leaping ahead. It's just weighing us down. And as Joseph Stiglitz, the great economist, says, we can't sacrifice the planet because some silly lawyers wrote some rules when they didn't understand the problem.
Hi, Ben Saylor, let me jump over here because we made eye contact with you. And I organized a fossil fuel divestment campaign here, so if you were a part of that, stand up.
Stand up!
I also work with the Michigan Student Council, and we're letting know that there are campaigns all across the state that are working with us. But the one issue that we're running into is with administration. They've told us outright that divestment campaigns are irrelevant on campuses because endowments as big as ours, $9 billion strong, are not political tools. So if you were able to come to, for example, a faculty senate meeting, or for example, a regents meeting, what would you say to an administrator who thinks that $9 million is not a political tool?
I would say thank you for that, thank you for your work. So $2.6 trillion worth of wealth has already joined the fossil fuel divestment movement. And so what I would say is get on the right side of history. You're political either way, and it is intensely political to invest that money with Exxon right now. It's intensely political to invest that money with Shell. So being apolitical in the face of this crisis is not one of the options available to us. So we just have to decide which side we want to be on. I want to thank the people in line for making space for more voices.
Hi, I think that climate change is a bit of a red herring that's artificially constraining the environmental movement, because even without climate change, we'd be on a collision course with planetary limits of a variety of types of topsoil loss, aquifer depletion, biodiversity loss, the loss of our ecosystems in the oceans. So what we're talking about is a radical way of just reorganizing our own lifestyles. And I'm wondering why you don't have more of a focus on people who are reorganizing their own lifestyles. Because as Americans, we consume 6 times as many resources the planet can reliably and sustainably produce. So we individually decrease our consumption of all resources by 80% or more. So what we're talking about is people living in eco-villages using permaculture, living more like indigenous lifestyle than industrialized lifestyle. So when you talk about policies, it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, because we're demanding these resources and they're supplying. That's how the economy works. So let's stop demanding them. Let's live more simply. Let's get rid of our cars, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the individual component of these people who are radically transforming their own lifestyle. Perhaps talk about your own plans to transform your own lifestyle so you can walk the talk.
It's a great question. And in the book, I do talk about that we are going to have to transform our consumption patterns, and this ideological project that I'm talking about, that has been ascended since the Reagan-Thatcher era, has transformed our lifestyles. I mean, we consume far more than we did in the 1970s, and I'm not, obviously, I talked about the Tyndall Center. When they talk about the kind of emission reductions that we need to see, they say that and that would bring us back to levels of consumption that would be more in line with consumption levels in the 1970s. That doesn't mean we have to consume what we consumed in the 1970s. Like, we don't have to wear bell bottoms if we don't want to. But in terms of, what happened in the 1980s with, and this is what my first book was about, was just the transformation of shopping into a way of life, the rise of lifestyle branding, and the attacks on the public sphere, I think have a lot to do with why shopping has become the #1 recreation activity for people who can afford it, and for people who can't afford it, because these things, and you call it chicken and egg, it is chicken and egg in the sense that if you're attacking the public sphere and ways that people used to draw a sense of community, then people try to fill those gaps elsewhere, right? So I do look at it more at a policy level, although I absolutely agree that we're going to have to change the way we live, including me. But the reason why I emphasize policy as opposed to those individual actions is because I actually believe that we overemphasize those individual actions, and that part of the problem the climate movement just a decade ago, we weren't talking about fossil fuel divestment. We were talking about changing light bulbs and riding bicycles and recycling and composting and a lot of really, really good stuff and eating less meat or eating no meat, and all of that will lower individual carbon footprints. But if we aren't regulating corporations, if we're allowing massive carbon frontiers to open up, we're going to get nowhere. Like, maybe I'm overcorrecting in the sense that I feel like there's actually been an absence of focusing on not just the policies, but the ideological project that underpins those policies, and that seeing ourselves as consumers first, as opposed to as members of our communities and people who can act collectively as members of our school community, as people in workplaces, people in neighborhoods, and people in countries and states, is actually a symptom of the triumph of neoliberalism. That we go first to what can I buy, what can I consume, how can I change my lifestyle, is part of the triumph of that logic. I deal with this all the time in my talks where it's like, I'm talking about a planetary crisis and people stand up and say, what is one thing that I can buy to fix this? And it's just like, you can't. There's no one thing that individuals can do. This is something we can only do together. All of those transformations are in lifestyle, and will show that it's not the end of the world, that actually it's better, and it's important to do for that reason. But I don't think we can mistake that for the actual scale of change we need. I'm going to get shorter answers.
All right. Prior to Obama's election, there was a massive grassroots movements for progressivism and climate action, healthcare reform, and then once he got elected, that movement dissipated and kind of fell off. So my question concerns Paris, and in Paris this year, there's been a massive climate movement that's formed around climate action, and if an agreement's reached, it'll be the first major agreement since Kyoto around climate action. It'll also almost certainly not be sufficient to prevent runaway climate change. And so my question is, do you see a risk in success in Paris getting an agreement causing the grassroots movement to lose momentum as people believe governments are taking action in this back now?
So thank you. I think I'm going to start getting more concise. I think the biggest risk with Paris, honestly, has to do with some of the mechanics of green NGOs and other NGOs, in the sense that there's this sort of, there's this bias towards claiming victory, right? So people send money, and then you say, you did it, you changed the world, right? And it's just like, and can we have more money? Because we need to change the world some more, right? So this is how a lot of organizing and fundraising works. The danger is we know that Paris is not going to be that victory, but we know that there is actually this incentive built in for groups to want to claim victory. So I think people need to, like, if you're involved in green organizations or different groups that are organizing towards Paris, send the message that we don't want false victories. We don't want to dress up a bad deal, as a good deal. At 350, we don't talk about the road to Paris, we talk about the road through Paris, to try to avoid that Copenhagen syndrome of like a summit to save the world. And then there's actually a psychologist in the UK who has diagnosed, she's coined coined this new syndrome called Copenhagen syndrome, because the people were so depressed after Copenhagen because they thought this was going to fix everything, and then it didn't, and then they didn't know what to do. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, it does matter, but we already know enough to know that it's going to be inadequate. And so, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing and keep building this movement that is growing, and the more it builds, the more policy victories we can see.
Thank you.